Just give us your sense of what military attacks on southern Gaza would look like.
I think the next phase of this operation, once the IDF have dealt with the northern part of Gaza, and they haven't yet completed their operations there, but once that's happened, then they will have to push south into Khan Yunis and Rafah and deal with the Hamas terrorists that are there. And when they do that, it's going to be a much more challenging problem because, of course, as we've been hearing in the last few minutes on your program, a lot of Gazan civilians have been pushed south from the north, and the population there is extremely dense. And in order to avoid killing innocent civilians, which obviously is one of the IDF's top priorities, and they do it extremely well, that means that a lot of those civilians are going to have to move again. And where they're going to have to move to, I think the IDF has designated an area in the southwest of Gaza, right by the coast, which will be a relatively safe area. And unless and until that's done, it makes it very difficult to deal with Hamas while minimizing civilian casualties. One of the problems I see here is that the United Nations has refused to involve themselves in trying to set up a kind of refugee area in that part of the country, because they say it implicates them in some way in Israel's military operations. This is a unique situation where the UN, which has responsibilities for looking after hostages, trying to prevent deaths in conflict, are basically washing their hands of it. It's quite an extraordinary situation, which certainly suggests to me that they don't actually value human life as much as they pretend to value human life.
That's a large accusation there against the UN. Just talking about, though, that, if possible, minimising civilian casualties. In your experience, your military experience, how possible is that, especially when some people just may not want to move anymore?
Well, yes, you're right. And some people may not. Some have moved already. It's a terrible situation for them. But I think most people would choose to move rather than remain in the path of airstrikes and armoured attacks by the IDF. Of course, who wouldn't? So I think the majority of people, if they're given the chance to move, will move. And they will be warned. They have, in some cases, been warned to move out of some of the areas like Khan Yunis already. They've been told they need to move to the southwest. But it's a human instinct to get to a safer area. But they need to be looked after when they get there. And that is the responsibility of, I believe in this situation, it is the responsibility of the United Nations, which has simply shrugged its shoulders, washed its hands and says, we're not going to help in this case. It's a real, I believe it's a real abrogation of their absolute responsibilities for which we pay them to exist.
The UN has come under a lot of scrutiny throughout this conflict, especially from the side of Israeli forces and government as well. I've heard a lot when I've been interviewing as well, so perhaps it's something we'll develop more as a story on this show. Look, Colonel, before we let you go, I just want to ask you finally on the international relations front, how much more pressure might Israel come under, do you think, to tone down its operations or even cease them or have some sort of ceasefire if its allies continue to raise concern about civilian casualties?
Well, I think Israel is coming under immense pressure from the United States. And frankly, although other allies are important, the United States is the only Israeli ally that really does count in this situation. And I think President Biden is, and we've seen it in some of the remarks he's made about, for example, he said recently that the continuation of the war gives Hamas what they want, and we mustn't allow it. It's an obscure and quite a twisted thing to say. The reality is the war must continue and Hamas must be destroyed. What Biden and other friends of Israel, allies of Israel, should be saying is that Hamas must surrender or they must get out of Gaza, not that the war against them must stop. But there is intense pressure, and I think that's only going to increase once this current ceasefire ends, if it does, and I'm not optimistic it will. And it sounds like a terrible thing to say that you're not optimistic that a ceasefire will continue, but I think the reality is unless Israel is able to and is allowed to by its allies to complete the defeat of Hamas, then the Israeli population stays under exactly the same threat as it was under on the 7th of October. And we saw the consequences of that.
We certainly did. Colonel Richard Kemp, thank you very much for making time for us.